Mr. Speaker, it's an honour for me to rise to deliver my second budget speech as Leader of the Opposition. As I said in my budget speech last year, the Opposition will never make political capital against the government at the expense of this community or without clear justification. Where we can work with the government, we will do so. Where on balance it is justified, and we believe that for the sake of national unity, we need to be adopting a different policy to the ones we have held in the past, we will also do so. We will not stick rigidly to partisan political lines, even where intellectually we would have been justified in doing so, if on balance it does not serve the national interest. Thus, for example, we attended the National Day rally last year despite our long-held position in government to depoliticize National Day. We've also done so on attendance at the United Nations Committee of 24, where I said publicly on more than one occasion on first becoming my party's leader that although we do not resile from our party's long-standing position that the 2007 Constitution created a modern non-colonial relationship with the United Kingdom with the maximum level of self-government short of independence and compatible with continued British sovereignty, we would, for the sake of national unity, attend provided that I could see the Honourable the Chief Minister's speech beforehand and agree the text with him. The Honourable Gentleman has not taken me up on that. On the attempt by the UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, to negotiate new terms of membership with the EU, I brought a motion to this Parliament within weeks of becoming Leader of the Opposition, calling on the Chief Minister and myself to work together so that Gibraltar's interests could be protected. Not once have I been briefed, despite his recent unilateral decision to undertake a consultation exercise on Gibraltar's inclusion in the customs union and Schengen. On our relations with Spain, I have said on many occasions, again, from very soon after I became Leader of the Opposition, that he and I should work together and devise a common strategy, and for us to be an example to future generations of politicians here in Gibraltar. He has never taken me up on that either. Last year, for 2 months, we suspended normal political activities and criticisms of the government to give the government the political space to resolve a difficult situation in the aftermath of the laying of the concrete blocks. He briefed me for those 2 months, but the briefings ceased as soon as normal political exchanges resumed. There are therefore many initiatives from this side of the House where we have held out an olive branch to the government on issues of national importance, and the reality is that for whatever reason, they have not been taken up by the government. Indeed, we have gone, Mr. Speaker, far further than they did when they were in opposition. That said, Mr. Speaker, what the government cannot do is equate its own narrow political interests with the interests of this community of Gibraltar. Every time it is met with criticism on their handling of public finances and indeed on their handling of relations with Spain, they are not the same. And indeed, I note, Mr. Speaker, that he has done precisely that during the course of his speech here today, this morning. Thus, whilst we welcome some of the measures, for example, the measures to encourage savings and also the measures to stimulate trade in Main Street that the Honourable Gentleman has announced today, and indeed the growth of the economy, we continue to have very real and considerable concerns about the way that the government is managing our public finances, including the opaqueness surrounding the expenditure of the Gibraltar Savings Bank and Credit Finance Company Limited, and the legacy of debt and spiralling expenditure that the Honourable Gentleman is leaving future generations of Gibraltarians. The seeds for the opaque mismanagement of our public finance today were sown by the Chief Minister in his political discourse at the last election, as we will see in a moment. It's a discourse that goes to the heart of whether honourable members, and the Chief Minister in particular, deserves the trust of the people of Gibraltar at the next election, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that the Honourable the Chief Minister's position remains riddled by substantial, fundamental and presentational contradictions, as he himself has always known, and which I said last year during the course of my budget address would catch up with him sooner rather than later if it had not already done so. Well, Mr. Speaker, it has caught up with him in this budget for reasons that I'm going to be developing in a moment. Mr. Speaker, what this budget shows is that the big lie has well and truly unraveled. Highest net public debt in the history of Gibraltar in monetary terms. Substantial increases in gross debt, despite the Chief Minister's address last year and his predictions that gross debt would actually go down. Highest levels of recurrent expenditure in Gibraltar's history. It is not surprising, Mr. Speaker, that the Honourable the Chief Minister has been so defensive about recurrent expenditure this morning, and he uses and deploys the well-known and tiresome mantra of blame the GSD. Well, Mr. Speaker, what the Chief Minister cannot do is on the one hand argue that our public finances were in a ruinous state in 2011 and claim credit for some miracle in 2.5 years while saddling the GSD with a recurrent expenditure because it was our fault, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the French saying, qui s'excuse, s'accuse, comes to mind, and the Chief Minister has done it perfectly this morning. Mr. Speaker, increases in recurrent expenditure outstripping increases in recurrent revenue in both percentage and monetary terms. Highest ever reliance on import duty, despite the Chief Minister decrying our dependence on it rightly from the opposition benches. Overspend across the majority of government departments, and a very worrying propensity, Mr. Speaker, for overspend in the Chief Minister's own department, number 6 Combin Place, Mr. Speaker. It really is, money is no object when it comes to number 6 Combin Place, as we will see in a moment. This, Mr. Speaker, from the gentleman that used to criticize his predecessor, Sir Peter Caruana, for his expenditure when he makes Sir Peter Caruana look like a veritable Scrooge in comparison, Mr. Speaker. And that, without taking into account the opaque investment, because that is what it is, of £400 million by the Gibraltar Savings Bank in Credit Finance Company Limited, over £70 million of which the government has already spent. Mr. Speaker, if the government has spent that £70 million directly, instead of using savers' money as its credit card, and accounted for that expenditure in these estimates of revenue and expenditure, the government would not be making anywhere near the kind of surplus it is making and declaring today, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it would be making a near loss. That is the fundamental reality of this budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for the last 2 years, my predecessor as leader of the opposition and I, Sir Peter Caruana, have been describing the 2011 election as the big lie election, involving not one big lie, but 2 big lies. One on the state of public finances and the level of public debt, which he described as astronomically high or in excess of the legal borrowing limits, and a second lie about electoral promises made to the electorate which were quite frankly undeliverable in the way that the Chief Minister said that they were going to be delivered, Mr. Speaker. He promised £750 million of capital projects and indeed huge increases in recurrent expenditure to boot. He promised to freeze rents, rates, electricity. to cut income tax, the effective rate, from 25 to 15%, to cut public debt by half, and to donate every single last penny of government surpluses to community care. Mr. Speaker, a veritable miracle by biblical proportions, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that if you are going to increase government capital and recurrent expenditure to those very significant and by Gibraltar standards astronomical levels, whilst at the same time cutting the income available to the government, because what you're doing is you're cutting income tax, freezing rates, rents, electricity, cutting the public debt and donating every single last penny of government surpluses to community care. How on earth did he expect to pay for it all, Mr. Speaker? In his very first address to this community on the 18th of January 2012, he appeared on public television on an emergency basis and spoke, quote, serious public debt problem, quote, a serious public finance problem, quote, an impenetrable curtain. He then went on to create the impression, an impression that he reinforced in the budget last year, and he's done so again this year, that there was somehow a sinister 100 million black hole in the public finances of Gibraltar. Mr. Speaker, it's a claim that he even repeated on Spanish television last year. If I had made such a criticism of his government on Spanish television, I would have been required to walk in procession, Mr. Speaker, from College Lane to number 6 Convent Place, self-flagellating myself in the process, prostrating myself in front of number 6 Convent Place until his party machinery had forgiven me for my supposed sin, Mr. Speaker. But of course, what he doesn't do, he doesn't judge his political opponents by the same standards that he judges himself, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, yet by the beginning of last year, when challenged by a GBC reporter on the levels of government spending in the light of that very bleak picture that he painted, barely 12 months earlier, he said that the government, and I quote, had cured, end quote, any public finance problems that he had inherited. Mr. Speaker, from financial ruin to the land of milk and honey in barely 12 months, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's simply not credible. And of course, Mr. Speaker, he had to find a miraculous cure pretty quickly, because this was a chief minister that was going to be embarking on some of the most expensive capital projects that we've seen in Gibraltar, Mr. Speaker. He would be soon spending money as if there were no tomorrow. 1,000 affordable homes at a cost of over £100 million. The cladding and improvement to 3 estates at a cost of nearly £100 million. The small boats marina at a cost of £24 million. Sandy Bay at the cost of between 5 and 10 million pounds. 4.5 million pounds, Mr. Speaker, on a semi-Venetian palace at number 6 Convent Place, Mr. Speaker. The Queen's Cinema, Commonwealth Park, and 25 million, as is today announced, on the Gibraltar International Bank, to name but a few. But also, Mr. Speaker, importantly, huge increases in recurrent expenditure. Mr. Speaker, last year I said that in comparison to the financial year ending the 31st of March 2012, the projected overall recurrent expenditure for the year ending the 31st of March 2014 will have risen by £66.6 million per annum, or £5.5 million per month. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the recurrent expenditure has risen during that period by £95.6 million per annum, or 7.96, nearly £8 million per month. That includes increases in recurrent departmental expenditure of £76.6 million per month, sorry, I beg your pardon, of £76.6 million, recurrent contribution to government-owned companies of 9.6 million, and 9.4 million paid in previous years to the Social Security Fund, which this year has inexplicably been transferred as a one-off payment out of surplus, which has artificially increased the size of the surplus, only for that money to then be paid from the surplus to community care. In other words, in the past, £9.4 million was paid to the Social Security Fund, from there to social assistance, and then from there to community care. This year, it's been treated as part of the surplus, and from there it's been paid directly to community care. Mr. Speaker, I will return to this later on, but for present purposes, it represents an increase of 28% in recurrent expenditure from the position that it was in March 2012, when the Honourable Gentleman first gave his first budget speech. Even if you take the 9.4 million from recurrent expenditure, as they have done, recurrent expenditure would still be £86.2 million more than it was in March of 2012, Mr. Speaker. An astronomical increase by anybody's standards from a government that won the election claiming that the public finances of Gibraltar were in a ruinous state, Mr. Speaker. But it's the implications of these huge increases for the community, and not the big lie in itself that concerns me, as I will explain in a moment. But the big lie is the reason for the Honourable Gentleman's blind gamble, for that is what it amounts to, a blind gamble with the future of our children and our children's children, because these levels of public expenditure are simply not sustainable, and someone at some point in the future is going to be left with an almost impossible task when the mess that he is creating comes back to bite us all, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recurrent expenditure for next year is expected to rise by 32% from the position it was in March 2012 to 108.95 million per year, an increase of £9 million per month. But, Mr. Speaker, almost across the board, there have been huge increases in expenditure and overspending in government departments from the levels that he predicted in his budgets last year. 24 out of 41 government departments have spent more than their allocated budget. 24 out of 41 government departments are overspending, Mr. Speaker. Number 6 Commonplace is spending 16 million per annum today compared to 7.5 million per annum in March 2012, Mr. Speaker. It's an excess over budget of 45%. The Honourable Gentleman cannot even keep within a budget in his own department, in number 6 Commonplace, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, number 6 Commonplace is spending 16 million today compared to 7.5 million in March of 2012, an increase of 112% rise in expenditure in the Chief Minister's own department since March 2012. Now, the Chief Minister may argue in his response that the IT department is within his budget now, therefore that would account for a large part of the increase because the IT department accounts for 1.1 million of the increase. However, even that 1.1 million pounds, Mr. Speaker, that increase only happened when the IT department was within his control, was within part of number 6 Commonplace. Even if I were to give him the benefit of the doubt for the increases within the IT department and other departments which have moved in and out since March 2012, there is still a rise in overall expenditure of £7 million, which is still an increase in his department of 93.5%, Mr. Speaker. And the increase is across all the items within his department. Total payroll, Mr. Speaker, at number 6 Commonplace has increased from £2.2 million in March 2012 to 4.26 million in 2014, with a further increase to 4.4 million by 2015. As at March 2014, number 6 was spending 2 million, or 91% more, in salaries than it was in March 2012. Excluding the IT department, it equates to 36% increase in salaries, Mr. Speaker. In 2015, the Chief Minister plans to increase the levels of staff by 7 more bodies. That is more than the total increase planned for the GHA during the same period, Mr. Speaker. Legal consultancy fees for number 6 Commonplace have increased by £666,000 in March 2012 to 2.25 million in March 2014, an increase of a staggering 237%. This despite significant increases in legal staffing levels employed directly by number 6 Commonplace during the same period. For the first time, there is a head for media monitoring, which comes in at £475,000. Mr. Speaker, I know that he likes to spend an awful lot of time monitoring what everyone says on social media, but £475,000 on media monitoring is an awful lot of money to spend on media monitoring. Travel and entertainment was an item that I focused on last year. The estimated figure was £390,000. The actual was 1.3 million, or a massive 287% over budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a question of priorities. Priorities, a word that he ought to learn and ought to be in his vocabulary, Mr. Speaker. I really cannot understand how all this expenditure on his officers can be justified when one looks at the priorities for this community, especially from a new dawn socialist party that claims to be the People's Party, Mr. Speaker. No one, or one has to ask, I beg your pardon, what benefit is there to the ordinary man in the street by this extravagant spending and overspending on number 6 Commonplace? Mr. Speaker, there has rightly been a public outcry regarding the availability of doctors' appointments at the primary care centre. The overspend on travel and entertainment alone of £920,000 could have employed 10 doctors for a year, Mr. Speaker, which would have dramatically reduced waiting times, yet the priority is given to the Chief Minister's own officers, and it would appear his own comfort, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps the next time that the leader of the New Dawn Socialists is near the primary care centre, he should pop in and explain to all those people that are hours waiting to see a doctor why he is spending so much money on his own officers, on his own staff, on his own travel and entertainment when they have to wait hours to see a doctor, Mr. Speaker. None of this, of course, takes into account the £4.5 million plush upgrade to his officers, or the Jaguar, or the Tesla, or the 3 or 4 Mercs, Mr. Speaker. And he had the audacity to criticize his predecessor for the gas-guzzling Jaguar, Mr. Speaker. Turning to other departments. Culture and heritage. Estimated spend was 3.7 million. The actual came in at 5 million, which means a 35% over budget. Utilities. The estimate was 48 million. The actual spend was 64 million, which means 33% over budget. Human resources was, the budget was 1.4 million, and the actual has come in at 2.4 million pounds, which means a 64% over budget. Treasury, the expenditure was 16 million, or the projected expenditure was 16 million, The actual came in at £17 million, or 6% over budget. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Father of the House is not here to listen to my response to the Honourable the Chief Minister's budget. But I know that he delights in reminding me, Mr. Speaker, that he has known me since I wore short pants. The issue whether I wore short pants or not shall forever remain a bone of contention between him and I. But we do go back a long way, and I know him as well as he knows me. And he must be absolutely gritting his teeth, Mr. Speaker, at forming part of a government that is spending at the levels that this government is spending, Mr. Speaker, and overspending across government departments. Whatever happened, Mr. Speaker, to his famous, and I think correct policy of the rainy day fund policy, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, to the extent that he forms part of a government, a socialist government, Mr. Speaker, a socialist government, that agrees to pay a former socialist activist in Hong Kong £250,000, Mr. Speaker, 10 times the national wage average here in Gibraltar, inclusive of the private education of his children, Mr. Speaker. Since when have socialist governments anywhere in the world, Mr. Speaker, paid for the private education of anyone's children, Mr. Speaker? The reality is that the Honourable the Father of the House is going to remain, Mr. Speaker, the only non-champagne drinking socialist at this rate on the government benches, Mr. Speaker. I hope that he's listening to this, because at this rate, and I hesitate to make the point because, Mr. Speaker, I'll incur the full wrath of his response, but at this rate, he's going to feel more at home on these benches than on theirs, because at least I used to listen to him when he used to talk to me about the need for financial prudence and the setting aside of a little bit of money in order to meet a situation when the going gets tough. A lesson that obviously the Honourable, the leader of the New Dawn Socialists, has simply not learned, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I now turn to recurrent revenue. Recurrent revenue increased by 19.97% since March 2012, whilst I have already indicated that expenditure has risen by 28%. From March 2012, recurrent revenue has increased by £90 million. Of that amount, 54.45 million, or 44%, was accounted for by an increase in import duty. Mr. Speaker, increases in recurrent expenditure are expected to continue to outstrip increases in recurrent income in both percentage and also monetary terms next year. The expected rise of revenue for March 2015 is only £2.5 million. The expected rise in expenditure is £22.8 million next year. What is concerning about these figures is that the bulk of the increase in recurrent expenditure is attributable to import duty. In March 2011, import duty accounted for 25% of total government revenue. Today, it accounts for 32.6%. Mr. Speaker, when he was on these benches and in these debates, indeed, in the speech that he gave when he was leader of the opposition, he's only one. He said that we needed to cut dependence on tobacco revenue. Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree, but dependence on tobacco revenue is going up. It's not going down. And it's been 2.5 years on his watch that this has continued to happen. Mr. Speaker, that careful calibration between increases in recurrent revenue and expenditure, which the government predicted at the last election, is not happening because the government's expenditure is out of control. That's the reality. I recently said in the Gibraltar Chronicle that the government is creating the ingredients for a perfect storm in future, and I have to say that I am more worried than ever having read these figures for this debate. And I emphasize again, that you cannot hermetically seal the public finances of Gibraltar from outside influences. Even the EU Commission visit on Wednesday of this week could have an important impact on important sectors of our revenue, Mr. Speaker. Our relations with Spain can also affect not only important sectors of our economy, such as gaming, which accounts for 20% of GDP and nearly 3,000 jobs, but also important revenue streams too, Mr. Speaker. And they have to be conducted in a calm, mature, intelligent way, Mr. Speaker. Less of the flashing of the cufflinks, Mr. Speaker, and more thought. And in this regard, I do congratulate him for his toned down UN speech that he delivered this year, a far cry from his speech last year comparing, whether he believes it or not, comparing Spain to North Korea, which I thought was one of the biggest own goals that any chief minister in the history of Gibraltar's politics has actually scored. Mr. Speaker, and I don't think that it's a coincidence that we have seen a decrease in certain revenue streams this financial year. Tourist site receipts are down by 5%. Bunkering charges are down by 33%. Ship registration fees are down by 17.2%. Revenue from vessels using the east side anchorage down by 45%. Upper Rock visitors down 3% compared to last year, down 30% when compared to 2012. Yacht arrivals down approximately 13%. The number of coaches arriving in Gibraltar via the land frontier down 33%. Gibraltar Museum revenues down 27%, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I now turn to my analysis of public debt. The gross public debt stands at £450 million and cash reserves stand at 96 million. That gives a net public debt figure of £354 million. In monetary terms, that is the highest net debt, public debt figure in the history of this community. Let me repeat that for the benefit of honourable gentlemen opposite. £354 million, the highest in monetary terms for net public debt in the history of this community, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and this is from a leader who decried the levels of public debt at the last election, and he is responsible now for saddling this community with the highest levels of net public debt in monetary terms in the political history of this community. Last year, he promised to reduce this figure by £12 million. Instead, it's actually risen by £76 million or 27%, and it's expected to rise again next year by £25 million. Even if you analyze it in gross public debt terms, which is their preferred method and was their preferred method at the last election, I remind the Chief Minister that last year he said that he was well on course to meet his manifesto commitment of reducing gross public debt to £260 million. Well, the outturn is £450 million, an increase, Mr. Speaker, of £74.3 million in gross public debt. Mr. Speaker, of course, he may decide to convert to GSD policy by arguing that we should not look at gross debt, but we should look at net debt, and net debt as a percentage for the size of the economy. And it happens to be 25%. But I leave that up to him in his reply. But if he does that, if he argues that it's low because it's net debt as a ratio of the size of the economy, well, perhaps he can also apologize to the people of Gibraltar for his misleading public discourse at the last election, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, these net and gross public debt figures do not even provide us with an accurate picture of public debt. And I'm turning to analyze the Gibraltar Savings Bank and Credit Finance Company Limited. Mr. Speaker, last year I said that the Gibraltar Savings Bank would, and I quote, become absolutely pivotal to any debate on public finance and the government expenditure over the next few years. End quote. Mr. Speaker, at the time that I uttered those words, I did not know about the existence of Credit Finance Company Limited. And unfortunately, I have been proved absolutely right. I also said this, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, I've been observing the Honourable the Minister responsible for the Gibraltar Savings Bank, Minister Vossana, for many years. I may not always agree with what he does or the manner in which he does it, but he does everything for a reason. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that I am wrong and that the government is not contemplating using that money. The consequences for these annual debates and the transparency of government finances would be considerable, because it would be a massive hole in the government's duty to account to this House at budget time for the expenditure, because as we all know, the Gibraltar Savings Bank expenditure is not reflected in these estimates. End quote. Again, Mr. Speaker, I made these predictions, which have turned out to be absolutely, totally accurate, because since they came into office, they have been effectively shifting government debentures, which rank as government debt, from the books of the government to the Gibraltar Savings Bank, where they do not rank as government debt. Of course, the government still guarantees all deposits, including debentures, in the Gibraltar Savings Bank. Mr. Speaker, in March 2011, the Gibraltar Savings Bank debenture stood at 27.6 million. 27.6 million. They now stand at 378 million plus 74 million in bonds. Including deposits, the total amount in the Gibraltar Savings Bank is £815 million, compared to 330 million in 2011. Mr. Speaker, in March of 2012, the government caused the incorporation of Credit Finance Company Limited, a company owned by the government and the Gibraltar Savings Bank. It did so with an initial investment from the Gibraltar Savings Bank of nearly £300 million. For a government that delights in issuing press releases on virtually anything and everything, it is remarkable that it made no announcement at all on such a huge investment of savers' money. Probably, Mr. Speaker, because they knew there was a by-election around the corner, Mr. Speaker. And when I asked in this House, before that by-election, whether the government had directly or indirectly provided any kind of financial assistance to the owners of the Sunborn, which would have led me to the existence of Credit Finance Company Limited, he said, and he could have answered yes, he answered, no, sir, only to come clean the day after the by-election, Mr. Speaker. The lack of transparency and accountability to this House in the handling of the finances of the Gibraltar Savings Bank and Credit Finance Company Limited will forever be a huge stain on his transparency and accountability agenda, Mr. Speaker. Yet further, Mr. Speaker, he still refuses to answer legitimate questions as to who is in receipt of loans from the government and in what amounts. It makes a mockery of this debate today. What is the point, Mr. Speaker, of having 24 meetings of Parliament, which he crowed about during his own address, if he will not answer questions on where Credit Finance Company Limited is spending that money, and that expenditure is not accounted for in these estimates of revenue and expenditure? It's the single most important assault on the democratic and parliamentary process since I have been in politics, probably ever. Mr. Speaker, Credit Finance Company Limited's only employees are its directors, the Chief Secretary, the Financial Secretary, and another senior civil servant. To date, the Gibraltar Savings Bank has invested 400 million, or 49% of all monies deposited in the Gibraltar Savings Bank, into this company, and the government has invested a further 30 million. You do not invest such colossal sums of money in a government-owned company unless you intend to make use of that money in some way. This is particularly so, Mr. Speaker, when one understands that the rates being offered by the Gibraltar Savings Bank are significantly higher than the rates available in the open market. There is a deliberate policy of making Gibraltar Savings Bank debentures as attractive as possible to encourage deposits within the bank, and anecdotal evidence suggests from the banking sector that even foreign investors are being encouraged to take advantage of the higher rates of return within the Gibraltar Savings Bank. And Mr. Speaker, it is simply not true to say that under the GSD government, the government could and indeed did make use of the monies deposited in the Gibraltar Savings Bank. It's not true. That is their policy, and it was this government that changed the law quite deliberately to allow them to do so. In March of 2012, the Chief Minister moved a bill to amend the Gibraltar Savings Bank Act and took out the requirement that the investments of the Gibraltar Savings Bank be limited to cash deposits or their equivalent. That is why we voted against the bill. The importance, for present purposes, is that as a consequence, we now have a situation where legally there is no longer a requirement for the government to invest in Gibraltar Savings Bank deposits in very safe forms of investments with very low returns. That is the reason why the investment of 400 million by the Gibraltar Savings Bank in Credit Finance Company Limited has been possible. And I repeat, it is inconceivable that the government is not going to be using that money, because it's already costing the Gibraltar Savings Bank a considerable amount of money in interest payable to debenture holders. So far, the government has spent 72.43 million out of the 400 million pounds, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I say the government because no one in a million years, unless still Her Majesty's opposition, is going to believe that the Chief Secretary and the Financial Secretary wake up every morning, hold a breakfast meeting, and unilaterally decide who Credit Finance Company Limited lends money to and who Credit Finance Company doesn't lend money to. It is a ridiculous notion to suggest that two senior civil servants decided unilaterally that they were going to be lending 30 to 40 million pounds, we don't know what amount, because he refuses to answer those questions, to the owners of the Sunborn. Absolutely ridiculous. They are obviously rubber stamping, Mr. Speaker, the decisions of the honourable gentleman opposite, of the government. The expenditure is properly the expenditure of the government. 23.05 million has been paid to pay off commuted pensions of civil servants. 49.42 million has been used to provide loans to the owners of the Sunborn and housing estates, of which we know of, because it could be others, but we don't know because he refuses to answer questions. 1 million has been used to allow individuals or entities to pay off their arrears, including tax arrears to the government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this not only inflates government recurrent revenue, because at its most basic, it's allowing individuals to pay off their debts to the government whilst parking a government debt in a government-owned company so that it's not reflected in these accounts, but it allows the government to use Credit Finance Company Limited to pay for expenditure that it would otherwise have had to meet through borrowing or its own reserves. Mr. Speaker, if the government had spent that money itself, it would not, the surplus would have been much more reduced this year, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it might have even made a loss. In other words, if you take out the 70 million out of the forecast surplus, that surplus will be virtually wiped out, Mr. Speaker. Now, even if you treat the loan book of 49.42 million pounds in accountancy terms as a loan from the government and not expenditure, the surplus would be reduced by the amounts that have been paid in commuted pensions of civil servants. And as I said at the beginning of my speech, that surplus has already been inflated by 9.4 million pounds, which has always been treated as a payment to Social Security and eventually to community care, which this year has been treated as a one-off payment to surplus and then paid from there to community care, thus inflating the surplus, Mr. Speaker. It smokes and mirrors economics. That's what it is. Conversely, if the government had borrowed the money Credit Finance Company Limited has paid out, there is no doubt that the net and gross public debt of this community would have increased by £70 million. So we would be even more in debt than we are now, debt directly attributable to the government, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it would be interesting to conduct the exercise, Mr. Speaker, when he is through next year, as to the amounts that he eventually spends out of that 400 million in Credit Finance Company Limited, and the levels of gross and net public debt, to see whether actually, if you take them both together, the legal borrowing limits set down in law would have been exceeded, Mr. Speaker, if the money that is being spent by Credit Finance Company Limited had been properly, as I say, properly been spent by the government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is the true face of the government he presides over. No economic miracle. He is mortgaging Gibraltar to the hilt. And part of that mortgage is being kept away from these estimates, which is what we have consistently objected to since this debate first arose last year. Finally, Mr. Speaker, on this area, these figures do not even take into account substantial expenditure by the government on, for example, the power station, I'll return to that at the end of my speech, or the installation of the liquid natural gas at the detached mole, and its supply to the power station or the land reclamation associated with it. It does not take into account any expenditure by the government on home ownership estates. There will therefore be more spending next year, Mr. Speaker, and they will either be more borrowing, either directly by the government or through Credit Finance Company Limited. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to economic growth. Mr. Speaker, the forecast gross domestic product for the financial year 2011-2012 was £1.137 billion, and the forecast GDP for 2012-2013 was £1.226 billion. Today, the Chief Minister has said that economic growth for the year ending the 31st of March 2014 was 10.3%, and that GDP was forecast to rise to £1.41 billion. Of course, Gibraltar is bucking global trends, as it's done since the financial crisis broke in 2007. These figures are therefore good figures. There is no doubt that there will be further growth next year, driven almost entirely, Mr. Speaker, by government projects. But we must, however, be careful about economic growth based largely on government projects, funded by borrowing. At some stage, that money will have to be repaid. Likewise, lending the owners of the Sunbourne or any other business £30 to £40 million to relocate to Gibraltar is not, with respect, the best economic model. This is not economic growth generated by huge inward investment. And I remind the Chief Minister that when he was leader of the opposition, and he was interviewed by Gerard Ouma in May of 2011, he said that just as the GSOP had international investors lined up before they were elected to government in 1988, so too did he have international investors lined up if he became Chief Minister of Gibraltar. Of course, he never gave any details, and that was understandable. But there's been an election, they won it, and I asked him on 4 separate occasions about these supposed international investors. After almost 2 years of asking him, he finally came clean in January of this year and said that it was a coin minting company from Austria that he had in mind in 2011. Mr. Speaker, talk about damp squibs. How on earth can he possibly compare himself to the first GSLP government? With the land reclamation, the Europort, the Euro Towers and everything, and all the international investment that quite rightly that first that first GSLP government has been praised for bringing to Gibraltar, to a coin-minting company, Mr. Speaker, from Austria. It's simply not comparable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman really needs to spend less time on photo opportunities and more time thinking about ways in which he is going to be attracting inward investment to Gibraltar. And indeed, we have a number of ideas on this side of the House on how to attract that business. And if he wants to, he can sit down with me and I will gladly impart some of those ideas. I have no reason to keep them to myself. At the end of the day, we're both working towards a common purpose. And if he wants to engage with me, I will happily engage and tell him about the ideas that we have on this side of the House for attracting inward investment. Mr. Speaker, during the course of his speech, he spoke about the web of companies supposedly the GSD had created during its 16 years. And then he said, in a reference to my honourable and learned friend, Mr. Bossino, and he has the audacity to talk about secret companies. Mr. Speaker, how on earth can you compare and how on earth can you contrast the creating of a government-owned company to the creating of a situation where you are allowing or incorporating companies registered at number 6 Combon Place with public servants as its directors, owned by GSLP activists, being provided by direct allocation with government contracts, subsidized also through the future job strategy, Mr. Speaker. How on earth is that comparable? Because it isn't, Mr. Speaker. He also spoke about the power station. Speaker, I had actually anticipated that he would be making the announcement of the power station during the course of his budget. But Mr. Speaker, he talked about in his speech, we've got to frame this debate in honesty. He said, frame the debate in honesty. And then he proceeds to talk about £67 million for the power station, but actually omitting to say that on top of the £67 million, he is going to have to spend money on the building of a liquid natural gas installation at the detached mole with a supply from that installation all the way to the power station, and that he's also going to have to spend extra money as well on the land reclamation, Mr. Speaker, because that's what he's going to do, and that the 120 million from this same company, because it's the same company, Mr. Speaker, that he has announced it was going to be building our power station, the 120 included a new building for Gibraltar, and it also included all the installations and all the infrastructure that was necessary, including storage facilities for that power station. Mr. Speaker, he is comparing apples with pears, but that is his style. He is overeager, Mr. Speaker, and often overplays his hand. That's what he does, losing credibility in the process, just so that he can say, blame the GSD and look at what the GSD is doing and look at what we are doing. If he spent less time thinking about the GSD and getting on with the business of running Gibraltar, Gibraltar would be all the better for it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the black hole, he seems to have forgotten, Mr. Speaker, what I said about the supposed 100 million black hole during the course of my budget speech last year. Let me remind him. After outlining the arguments about the 100 million black hole, I basically said, as my honourable and learned friend Sir Peter Caruana explained last year, this so-called 100 million black hole is attributable entirely to the fact that the public debt ended higher and cash receipts ended up lower than the government had estimated at the start of the year. It happened before. In 2009, 2010, it was estimated it would finish the year at 116 million, and it ended at 148 million. In 2010, 2011, 180 was estimated, and it finished at 216 million. All it takes, Mr. Speaker, is for capital expenditure to proceed more quickly than budgeted for for capital receipts from the sale of assets, or for capital receipts from the sale of assets to be delayed, or a combination of both to produce this effect. The GSLP opposition, Mr. Speaker, has never criticised that position before in any of the statements that it made during the course of this debate in the past. Last year, Mr. Caruana said, and I quote, "Delayed asset receipts for the year remain on stream to come in now or in the future." Well, Mr. Speaker, he was absolutely right. If the honourable member looks at page 143 of the estimates, actual receipts for last year from the sale of government properties and other premia amounted to £1.4 million, whereas the forecast outturn for this year is £102 million, an increase of just over £100 million. End quote. There's your black hole, Mr. Speaker, a black hole of the honourable gentleman's own invention, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last year, to conclude, he said that what needed to go down had got down and what needed to go up had gone up. Not even he can maintain a straight face, adept as he is at it, keep a straight face whilst making that remark for this budget today. We finally see his true face, Mr. Speaker. We finally see that this is no economic miracle, a miraculous cure for an illness he himself invented at the last election. He is mortgaging the future of Gibraltar, the future of our children and our children's children to the hilt to pay for a plethora of reckless promises he made at the last election. That, Mr. Speaker, is his true face.